carrying out an SBA for Geography, and my topic sentence is, what are the effects of coral reef destruction and how are they maintained within the Grace Bay area, Providenciales, Texas and Caicos Islands? What would you say is the role or importance of the coral reefs in the TCI?
Okay. The importance of coral reefs in the Turks and Caicos Islands is that I think that you could say they make up the foundation of the islands in the sea. They are our first line of defense against the open ocean, and they are sort of what sticks to the side of the summit that we sit on, this big limestone platform. They are what covers it and protects it. Limestone is very soft, it's easy to wear away from water, but the coral, being on the outside of it, actually acts as a barrier, and it actually acts as a breakwater against the sea. We have quite low islands, and rather than having big waves coming in and crashing on our shores that could come up onto the land, we have small waves because the coral reef breaks the big waves.
How important is it that we maintain or preserve the coral reefs in the Turks and Caicos Islands?
I think our long-term survival depends upon it. I think it's that important. I think the long-term survival of the islands depends upon it. Right now, we have a coral reef protecting us from large waves from the sea, and those waves are going to get bigger as climate change occurs and the seas get warmer. We're going to have more of a danger of sea surge from hurricanes, and we may even experience sea level rise. There's some evidence that that's happening already. And as the sea levels get higher, the coral reefs are going to become more and more important for protecting us from the ocean. So I think that our survival depends upon us protecting
Negative or positive effects will the coral reef have if not preserved or maintained on our environment and marine environment, land and sea?
Well, I think that the effects will be undoubtedly negative. I think there may be a few species of animals that benefit from the coral reefs not being there, maybe a few species of plants. But what we will get is an environment where the diversity of fish and plants goes down. So we may still have fish, we may still have plants in the marine environment and in the adjacent coastal environment, but the diversity of those species will be diminished. So, for example, in the sea, if the coral reef is degraded, you may have lots and lots of algae covering dead coral, but there are only so many fish we have here that can depend upon algae, and in fact, if a reef gets too covered with algae, it will die. The fish will leave it except for those that graze on it. But the other fish that require the coral and the animals that depend on the coral, such as the parrotfish, which eat coral, some of the shrimp and anemones that live within the reef, they will not be able to survive in that habitat and they'll leave. As far as the coastal habitat goes, what we will experience is a larger incidence of waves breaking on the shore, heavier. They may wear the sand dunes down, they may even eliminate the sand dunes, and we have quite a few plants and animals that depend upon the sand dune community, including the endemic rock iguana.
What factors would affect the growth and development of the coral reef?
The growth of the coral reef, there are things that benefit the coral, are going to be very clean and nutrient deficient water. They like water that's completely clear and doesn't have a lot of pollutants or nutrients in it. They also require strong sunlight, so they have to be somewhat near the surface. And they require some amount of protection from heat. They require a certain temperature gradient. Corals don't typically like cold water. There are cold water corals in the world, but most of them like warm water. But they don't like water that's too hot. Anything in the upper 80s actually will cause coral to become ill and even die. So really, that is the set of things that the coral need. As far as other things that could affect the growth and development of the reef, human interference with the reef, and that includes boats anchoring on the reef, people standing on it or touching it, and the coral dying because of that. In some parts of the world, they use dynamite or chemicals to extract fish and lobster from the reef. There's even been chemical extraction done here before, and those things are illegal because they will harm the reef. So human activity can really devastate a coral community.
I see, so coral reefs would be better off without the humans.
Yes, without sounding too much like what we call a misanthrope, I think that most of nature would be better off without humans, or at least the number of humans that are alive today. We don't tend to live in harmony with nature anywhere that we exist now, except in very few
Coral
places.
reefs maintaining? Like, what does it take for it to stay alive?
Okay, so the way that nature maintains the coral reefs is by providing them with the food that they need, the climate that they need, and a place to attach. So the water around the Turks and Caicos is a great place for coral to grow because the Turks and Caicos Islands are limestone, and coral are making their shells essentially out of limestone. So they're building the reef out of the material that the islands are made of, so they're actually able to bond to it. Also the sunlight that we have, which is pretty constant, we don't have too many overcast days here, that's really important for coral. And the other thing that's important for coral is that we're within a current here in the ocean, and the current is carrying things in from other marine habitats, and that includes the small microorganisms, plankton of various sorts, and that's what the coral needs to eat. The coral eats in two ways. At the nighttime, the coral polyps come out of their shell and they extend their tentacles into the water and they catch little microorganisms that come by, plankton, and they eat it, and that's like their meat. And then in the daytime, they're actually making food as well. They use the sunlight to produce food because inside a coral's body they have algae, and the algae produces sugar like all plants do. The coral gives the algae a place to live and grow that's safe, and as its payment for that rent, the algae gives a little bit of its food to the coral. And that essentially all day the coral is eating its vegetables. So they get a very well-rounded diet from that. And that's what really it takes, the sunlight, the warmth, making sure the water's never very cold and not too hot. It takes that for nature to maintain the coral reef. The way that we maintain the coral reef as its protectors is mainly through laws. And the laws include where you can put your boat and how close you can get to the coral. We have a number of protected areas that protect the coral reefs so that people can't remove things from them. And we also protect the reef by researching it and monitoring it. We actually have lots of people that go out and look at the reef as tourists, but some of those people have a deeper commitment to the reef, and what they do is when they're going out to look at it as tourists, they're also recording what they see. If they see a problem, they're reporting it to us. If they see some kind of activity going on that is illegal, they will report it to us. And that is one of the ways we maintain the reef, is by having a good community that knows how important it is. I think that the study that was done a few years ago estimated that the coral reef gives to the country nearly $60 million a year worth of environmental services. And that is an incredible amount that protects us and gives us money through tourism and other things like that. And so people know it's important, and they're going to maintain it as, if nothing else, as a breadwinner for the country.
What are the pollution problems that cause coral reef destruction?
Okay, pollution that can cause coral reef destruction include a whole family of things. Not all that are first apparent. Some of them are things that come down the line. So one of the most easy types of pollution to see in a coral reef is anything chemical. When a person uses bleach or ammonia or something else to spray into a crevice to get the lobsters or the fish to come out and catch them, that is a form of pollution on the reef itself. Also an oil spill or any other chemical spill is a form of pollution that would really destroy what's going on. The problem that the coral reef has to face is the nutrification of the water. So too much nutrient going into the water, which causes algae to grow too fast. And while the coral likes to have algae inside it, it doesn't like to have algae growing on its outside. And the algae growing on the outside of a coral can actually block the light from the algae that the coral needs. So for example, things like this would include sewage from humans, and we don't treat our sewage in a sewage treatment plant here, we typically put it in the ground in a cesspit, and usually we forget about it. There are lots of cesspits here that are equipped with different digestion systems that break the waste down so that it's cleaner, but lots don't have that. And even if they do have it, they're still breaking the waste down into various chemicals that are eventually going to end up in the groundwater and then eventually out to sea. Another factor of this is the use of fertilizers on land, and anything that we put on the land is eventually going to get washed into the sea. So using fertilizers on lawns, in gardens, in golf courses, things like that can actually leach into the ground and eventually go out to the sea. And what you can see is that the water is becoming more and more nutrified and the algae is growing better. And so that's one way that we pollute that a lot of people don't realize. And finally, you have pollution that's sort of second-tier pollution that's not direct. And that includes any of the pollutants that are theorized to be responsible for global warming. So for example, any kind of burning of fossil fuels or other combustion that's sending pollution up into the air that is causing greenhouse gases to become more prevalent. Then we're actually seeing the effect of that as the global warming and the rise of temperature at sea and the climate change that is affecting the corals through that way. So even though the exhaust from a car in Miami doesn't directly pollute our reef, it indirectly pollutes the reef by assisting the temperature change in the climate.
Tourism a new pressure and a new problem to coral reefs?
I think at first, when the Caribbean in general was first attracting tourists in large numbers, I think that it was a problem to coral reefs because people didn't know how to treat them. And when you watch old films from as far back as the turn of the last century, around the 1900s, all the way up through sort of the 60s and 70s, the treatment of coral reefs was to treat them like big piles of rocks. And it was considered okay to stand on them, and it was considered okay to climb around on them underwater, use your hands to pull yourself around, to break pieces off and take home, to collect shells from them. Those were things that were considered okay back then, but we now have a very different approach to the reef, and it's not just here in Turks and Caicos, it's all around the Caribbean. It's actually very difficult to find a country in the Caribbean that doesn't protect its reefs in some form. And it's also very difficult to find tourists that are completely unaware of the coral reef and how to protect it. So most of the time these days when tourists go out in a boat, they're told by their boat captain right away that they're not to walk on the reef, not to take things back from it. They're told that they're in a national park or a nature reserve. So they're aware of that. And so I think now tourism, while it used to be a negative pressure on the reef, I think it's now a positive pressure on the reef. And the reason that is because we're getting a lot of money from these people that are coming in to look at our reef and fish. And they are going to put pressure in two ways. One is they're going to put pressure by what they say, which is when they come back to the dock, if they were extremely upset by seeing that another tour company had put their anchor in the reef, or that for example, there were people removing shells from a protected area that they knew was protected, they're going to say something to someone. They're going to have that to say. And a lot of times in marketing, they say that if a person has a good experience, they will tell 3 or fewer people, but if they have a bad experience, they'll tell 9 or more people about it. And so the bad word spreads a lot more quickly. The other way that they're going to put pressure is by where they put their dollar. If they come to a country and they see that the coral reef is totally destroyed because it has been allowed to be fished to having no more fish at all, or that people are still allowed to use dynamite or chemical fishing, or that they're not discouraged from doing that, they're going to go somewhere else. And that means that some other country is going to benefit from their dollar. And that's the two ways that they can really put pressure positively on the problem of coral degradation. A complete understanding on exactly why the algae leaves the coral when they get too hot, but it does happen when the water temperature goes too high. When the water temperature is sustained above 82 degrees Fahrenheit, the coral react in a way that is they expel the algae out of their bodies. When that happens, it's called coral bleaching, because a lot of the color that is in a coral is actually from the algae in it. And because coral are made out of limestone, effectively, calcium carbonate, they're white. They're not actually the colors that they look like. Their skeleton is white, the same color as calcium, as bone, as teeth. And so when the colors from the algae leave the coral, they turn white and they die. This is also something that happens when coral are sick from other diseases like viruses and bacteria. The live coral die, and then what's left is the skeleton. But exactly why the coral spew out their algae when they're warm, we don't know. What we do know is they can recover from it to some extent, but it requires a change back to having cool water patterns for a couple of years. They can't do it within just a few months. Reef coral itself, most coral is a marine organism. It has to survive in salt water. So most coral cannot survive in fresh water at all. There are a few sort of coral things that grow in fresh water, but the majority of them are saltwater. So if you took our coral reef and put any corals from our reef and put it in fresh water, they would die. And that's also true of the majority of our fish as well. If you put marine fish in fresh water, most of them won't survive. There are a few fish that can swim between salt and fresh water, but when a fish or a coral or any other organism is living in salt water, it has a problem to solve, and that is it needs water for its body, but it can't drink the water in the sea. And so instead of being a fish or a frog or something that lives in fresh water that can just drink whenever they need water, the organisms in the marine environment have to use energy that when they drink salt water, the energy in their system is used to transport the salt out of their body through what's called active transport. So their cells are extracting the salt from their body and putting it out, and they're using energy to do that. So a huge amount of any marine animal's energy use goes towards active transport of getting rid of salt, and that's what they need. If you take a saltwater fish and leave it to live in fresh water for too long, it will actually get to the point where it sort of inflates. And the reason is because the fish's body is more salty than the fresh water, so the fresh water is moving in, and the fish has no salt to put out anymore, and so its balance goes, and so they sort of swell up and then they die. But coral also, the same way, they cannot survive in fresh water. What they do need is clear water, and they need clear water rather than turbid water because they need the sunlight to be able to penetrate. Sunlight penetrates water to anywhere between 30 feet, some wavelengths of light 30 feet and some more, but really the coral that use algae are living in the top sort of 30 feet of water, and they need it to be very clear in order for the sunlight to travel. I think that there are reasons beyond human gain. However, it's very difficult to convince some people that there are reasons beyond human gain to do anything. There are a lot of people in the world that are living for the day, and they're living that way because they have to. And there are places in the world where the coral reef is being destroyed because someone is not worried about whether or not it's protecting their island from a tsunami or from a storm surge. What they're worried about is how they're going to feed their children that day, and that's it. How am I going to put food on my table today? And when a person, their sole way of feeding their family is by going out and getting fish from a reef, and the reef has already been degraded, and the only option that they have to catch enough fish to survive is using chemicals or using dynamite, then that's what they're going to do. And so to convince, for example, a fisherman who lives like that he has to stop doing that, it's not going to work because he needs to feed his family. What has to be done is he has to have another option to feed his family. He has to be given other choices to make so that he doesn't have to damage the reef. But I think that it is our responsibility, my personal opinion is that it's our responsibility as humans to protect the reef and save it not only for future generations of humans, but for future generations of other creatures that need it. Now, this is my own personal conviction talking. This is not scientific fact. I think that it's very arrogant of humans to think that we're the most important thing on the planet, when in fact we're one of the biggest problems on the planet. And I think that if we continue to have the arrogance that we are the center of the universe, it's going to be our downfall. Whereas if we have the attitude that all of the other organisms that live on this earth have the right to live and have the right to survive and have the right not to go extinct, then we will have a much better picture of what's really going on, that we're only a piece of the puzzle, we're not the master. And I think if we see that, then we'll recognize that there are reasons beyond our own survival to allow these species to survive by protecting them. But like I said, convincing people that that's important when they're worried about the bottom line, they're worried about feeding their family, or they're worried about making their next million. It's the same sort of mentality, I guess. It's very difficult to convince people of that, but yeah, there definitely are reasons.
Well, this has been Benson Williams carrying out an SBA for Geography, interviewing Mr. Brian Mako. I thank you for your time, sir.
You're quite welcome.